Hi guys, welcome back for the second half of Notes 3 on the Great Depression. Remember, today you need to have at least two different colors, whether they're different colored highlighters, crayons, markers, doesn't matter. We're just going to do a little work on that map you see on page 10. So yesterday I left off on our timeline, which is on page 2 of your packet. We're going to write in for 1929 that the stock market crashed, but remember, that is really just the beginning of the Great Depression. It is what causes the economy to start tumbling downward, and all of those effects that we talked about yesterday in terms of loss of jobs, businesses closing, banks closing, stock market values going down. So after the stock market crash, President Hoover, he tried really to reassure Americans that if we just continued business as usual, then he would, or we would, as a country, see ourselves sort of bounce back. He believed in something called rugged individualism, which is a very American ideal, which is that people will succeed through their own effort. So if Americans would just take care of themselves, not depend on handouts, if we kind of pull up our bootstraps and work hard, that the economy would bounce back. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. What you're seeing here is a picture of something that is called a Hooverville, named after President Hoover, where Americans who had lost their homes found whatever resources they could, tin, pieces of wood, newspaper sometimes, and built these shanty towns, these shacks in groups right outside of cities. Americans had suffered through economic depressions before, to be sure. The government had always left the economy alone to recover on its own, so President Hoover assumed that this was no different. But previous depressions hadn't lasted very long. They were small dips in the economy where the United States bounced back. But by 1930, it was pretty clear that the economy was not going to adjust itself anytime soon. And President Hoover, of course, was hoping that by 1932, when he would be up for re-election, that it would be back completely. But meanwhile, while he was just kind of waiting it out, homelessness increased, families began forming little shanty towns that became known as Hoovervilles, and many Americans felt President Hoover should be doing more to help those Americans who were struggling through homelessness and joblessness. Many people moved to Washington, D.C., hoping to make an impact on the government because they would be kind of having to drive past them and see them and their struggles. All right, here's Herbert Hoover on page 9. He is the president when the Great Depression began. He was very slow to respond because of his belief in rugged individualism. He was not re-elected in 1932, and that, again, is because Americans felt that he could be doing more. Homeless tent cities popped up around major cities, and they were named Hoovervilles after President Hoover. Now, there were other things named after President Hoover in order to kind of show Americans' disgust with his lack of involvement and the government's lack of help. All right. Like a Hoover blanket, for example, was a newspaper. So as time moved forward, life changed quite a bit for Americans from that prosperous time of the 1920s. Some other examples, Hoover flags, were when you have your pants pockets turned inside out. You can see there's no money in them. A Hoover wagon was a car where you couldn't afford the gasoline, so you pulled it with a horse. Or when the soles of your shoes wore out, you would put cardboard on the bottom to replace it. That was called Hoover leather. Now here's another example of one of those houses where Americans who were homeless would find just about anything to kind of scrap together a home, a shelter. Part of the reason that Americans would go to D.C. Was to support their passage of the Putnam Bill, which would have been very beneficial to World War I veterans. So we see lots of veterans showing up in Washington, D.C. They organized a march, which they called the Bonus March on Washington. And the bonus was, if the Putnam Bill was passed, American veterans from World War I would have gotten a bonus check. And it was promised to them even before the Great Depression started. They were still waiting for it. And ultimately, when the when the March on Washington happened in December of 1932, and they were fighting for that $1,000 bonus check to be given to them immediately instead of waiting until its scheduled date of 1945. See these men, they're sleeping out in front of the Capitol building, hoping that it will be passed so they can get their money. They become known as the Bonus Army because they are former soldiers. But unfortunately, in June of 1932, the Senate votes against the Putnam Bill. Hoover calls the Bonus Marchers communists and criminals, which is disgraceful to many Americans because these are men who had fought for the United States. Marchers end up clashing with soldiers over their anger. Hoover tells the Bonus Marchers to go home. Most did, but 2,000 refused to leave. And then Hoover sends a force of 1,000 soldiers to push them out. So we have soldiers, current soldiers, pushing veteran soldiers out. 2 veterans were shot. I believe a baby died during the shuffle. And Americans, of course, were outraged with Hoover for his actions. Here are just some images from that clash. Now, many Americans were on the road, so to speak, homeless, looking for jobs, moving from place to place, and the word hobo started to be used. But there were other groups of people who were on the move that got a different nickname, which were the Okies. Now, hobos, or homeless Americans who were wandering around, hitched rides, they rode railroad cars, they were searching for jobs for the most part, and a better life in a different town. One activity became known as riding the rails. Society didn't view homelessness as being shameful during this time. That 2 million Americans were homeless during the Depression. It just was a way of life for many Americans. And so during the Great Depression, some people, primarily men, teenage boys, took advantage of their homelessness and rode the rails all across the United States. It wasn't legal, of course. You had to hide from the supervisors, like this guy. And then over the course of time, hobo markings became a way of communicating in terms of what was a safe place to stop or a friendly place to stop. They might be left on a fence post or the side of a building so that they'd be visible for the hobos who would come along later. So imagine you're riding the rails and you jump off and you see this sign right here. Do you choose to steal the bread that you see sitting on the open kitchen window, or do you keep walking? Well, hopefully you chose number 2 because this sign means man with a gun. So if you try to steal the bread, you might have been shot. Or how about this one? You keep walking, you see another farmhouse. You think you'll try to sneak into the barn so that you can sleep there for the night, but you notice this marking, this X in a circle. Do you go to the farmhouse and ask for food, or do you keep walking? If you chose to keep walking, then you missed a free meal. This sign means good for a handout. And what about this one? The next day you're walking by a small house when you notice that they have a large apple tree with plenty of juicy, ripe apples. You think about hopping the fence, grabbing a few for dinner, but you see the marking below, marked on the fence. Do you jump over and steal some apples, or do you keep walking? Well, hopefully you either went to the door and asked, or you kept walking. If you'd hopped the fence, you might be in some trouble. This sign means mean dog here. Here's a few more hobo signs that were developed during the Great Depression. So those who were homeless and moving from city to city to look for jobs would know where they could stop. You could also head over to what is called a soup kitchen. Many charities and even the government stepped in eventually under the next president, opened up these storefronts that would serve you a piece of bread and some soup. Soup was easy because you could always increase the amount by adding some water. So we see thousands of people lining up each day for maybe their only meal at a soup kitchen. Here's another example of people lining up to get their bread and have some soup. And I love the picture above them. There's no way like the American way, world's highest standard of living. All right, as cities were experiencing failing businesses, Americans in the Central Plains region of the United States were facing an agricultural disaster. During the 1930s, a combination of poor farming practices and years of drought created howling dust storms. Ranchers had allowed cattle to overgraze, trees had been cut down for lumber, farmers had worn out the soil, so without adequate rainfall, the topsoil in the Great Plains was pretty much picked up, formed black blizzards of drifting dust that covered farms, machines, and sometimes even homes. So the Dust Bowl is what this becomes known as the topsoil blows across the Great Plains due to poor farming practices, lack of rainfall, creating these black blizzards of dust, destroying over 100 million acres in the Great Plains. Now you have your map, so choose two colors. I have orange and yellow, and maybe pause the video so that you can go ahead and color in the two different areas. The severe damage was kind of centered over Oklahoma, and the moderate damage is across the whole of the Great Plains, including our neighbor, South Dakota. So here are causes again of the Dust Bowl: drought, very high winds during the early years of the 1930s, overproduction of crops, which means we're tilling up all kinds of topsoil, and the loss of those prairie grasses. So the Dust Bowl, that region of the United States where drought, deforestation, and cattle grazing had caused the soil to dry out and form severe dust storms. You can go ahead and grab your highlighter and decide which of those phrases you would like to highlight. Now, what we're seeing here is an example of some of the migrations that took place during the Great Depression. And primarily due to the Dust Bowl, we see many people from the Great Plains starting to move out west. There's an example of a family trying to keep the dust out by putting newspaper over the crevices of their house. It was like a barren wasteland during this time, nearly impossible to grow anything and stay clean. We see a new illness develop called black lung. So by 1938, nearly 100 million acres in the Central Plains had lost 5 or more inches of its topsoil. 3.5 million people left the Great Plains when the Dust Bowl destroyed their farms. So you see some examples here of families moving west with whatever they could carry on their cars, sometimes walking. Some moved to those neighboring states, others traveled all the way out to the West Coast. A large percentage were those from Oklahoma, where they were hardest hit, which is why this group of people becomes known as the Okies. Here are some of those migration patterns. So the view society had before this era was that people needed to be responsible for their own economic stability. As the Depression dragged on, though, President Hoover gradually softened his policy, creating some jobs by signing off on the building of the Hoover Dam, which cost $700 million. I have a video on that if you'd like to check it out in the extra resource.